So tonight I thought we could talk about heart-centered shadow work. And so shadow work and the shadow in general, it's one of those topics that can seem kind of daunting, can seem kind of scary or negative. It can seem like hard work, something that we have to force ourselves to do. And the shadow often gets a bad rap. And that's because it's in the shadow are the things that society has taught us are bad about ourselves, that we've been conditioned by our parents or by our school, by our teachers or by employers. It's all the things that we've been taught are bad about ourselves, things that are wrong with us, our character flaws, our defects, or how we're weak or wrong in any sense. And that's really a shame, because all of those things in the shadow, all of the compulsive desires that we have, all the unhealthy patterns that we have, all the things that cause us to harm ourselves or cause us to harm other people, those are all just expressions of the unresolved wounds within us. Those are all coping mechanisms that we learned to deal with the repressed emotions from the wounds or traumatic events that we experienced, that we didn't have the support or the knowledge or the ability to work through those emotions at the time when the wound happened. And so we repress them, and then we develop these coping mechanisms or defense mechanisms to protect ourselves from feeling more pain, especially if we're in situations where the same kind of wound keeps occurring over and over again. We develop these coping mechanisms to protect us from those wounds. And then oftentimes these coping mechanisms can tend to negatively affect our relationships and affect ourselves negatively throughout the rest of our lives. But all of these bad quality, all these character defects, they're all defense mechanisms that we had to develop to protect ourselves. And so shadow work, or examining our subconscious, if it's done in a way that's not careful, it can just make us feel bad about ourselves. If we just look at what's wrong with ourselves without looking at the underlying cause, it can cause us to just list all the things that are wrong with us and cause us to make us feel like we're horrible people because we have all these things in our shadow, all these bad traits, all these negative character defects. But used in a healthy, loving, or heart-centered way, examining our shadow can lead us to the parts of ourselves that just need more love. It can lead us to the wounds that are at the core of these unhealthy patterns that cause us to harm ourselves or harm others. And so one example from my personal life, I know I've talked about this before, but for a long time, for most of my adult life, I had a very unhealthy pattern in relationships, in romantic relationships, where I would, go through this period of initial infatuation where I was totally consumed in love. And then after the infatuation wore off, this wall would come up within me and I would withdraw emotionally from the relationship. And so I repeated this over and over again throughout my adult life, causing lots of pain for my partners and for myself. And so just looking at it like that, if I only looked at the shadow, if I only looked at what's wrong, it made me seem like a bad person, because I would do this over and over again. I would get into a relationship and then withdraw and cause a lot of pain. It was only just recently, working with my therapist, I was finally able to get to the root of that pattern, get to the root of that unhealthy pattern, and find a wound from my childhood, where the reason I would withdraw emotionally is because I was afraid of losing love. I was afraid of having love and then losing it. And so to protect myself, because I experienced a loss of love in my childhood. And so to protect myself from losing love again, I would emotionally withdraw from the relationship, because if I wasn't emotionally invested, then I couldn't lose the love. I couldn't be hurt again. And so once I finally identified that wound at the core of this unhealthy pattern, then I could start applying, giving love to that wound, giving love to my 7-year-old self that experienced that loss of love. So I'm starting to heal that wound. And hopefully moving forward, I won't have to repeat that unhealthy pattern. And so it's critical. It's very important that when we look at our dark sides, when we look at the, the parts of ourselves that society has told us that should be ashamed of, that we're gentle with ourselves, that we keep looking until we find the wound driving the unhealthy pattern. Because our society teaches us that these bad things about ourselves, our society just conditions us to try to ignore them, because we learn that if we have them, it means we're bad people. So that teaches us just to try to ignore them, just to try to pretend they're not there, just to try to repress the pattern, repress the compulsive desire, instead of examining it and figuring out what's driving it and finding the wound that's underneath it. And so it's very important for us to, if we choose to look at the shadow, if we choose to dive into our unconscious, that we do so looking for the place that needs more love, instead of looking for what's wrong with us. And so I think that's about all I have to say about that. Any questions or comments?